Hello everyone, we are getting so close to the end of our semester. As we kind of choose out different chapters to use out of your sociology textbook, we obviously can't cover all of the chapters because there is so many chapters for this textbook. So one of the important textbooks to cover is definitely about education. We want to talk about the difference between education and schooling. You may have heard people say, well, you don't go to college to get a job, you go to college to get an education. While many of you who are taking this class are saying, nope, I'm pretty much going to get a job, I would absolutely agree with you on that. But education really is about the social institution through which society provides its members with important knowledge, including basic facts, job skills, and cultural norms and values. So taking sociology is part of that. Some of the video assignments and different reaction papers that you've done hopefully have kind of awakened your eyes a little bit to some of the differences that we have in the United States. And schooling is a very formal part of education, but it really is about the actual instruction under trained teachers. So if we look at schooling and economic development, we're going to break down some of the countries that your book talked about. The first one we're going to discuss is India. In India, there is definitely a difference in how we educate by gender. Many of the individuals who live in India and India as a culture really do not see a reason to educate girls. And while they may have some initial kind of introduction to schooling, they typically do not go on to get much education whatsoever. And really, most poor families, depending on the children's earning potential, that will really drive who will go to school and who will not go to school. Now, Japan, you may have heard, really produces very high achievers, and going to school is very much about tradition and obligation to the family. That is very important. Students take very difficult exams, and we found that in comparing curriculums between the United States and Japan, that their students are getting more of what our high school students get in late elementary. So they really have a push for their children. Only half of high school graduates, though, enter college. So although there is a very high pride on education, they only send kind of their best and brightest on to college. If we look at Great Britain, most attend state schools, which we call public schools, but actually it's the reverse in Britain. And this is going to be important for your test. I specifically remember putting a quiz question on your test about this. But in Great Britain, most state schools have, everyone can go to the state schools, but the private or the public schools is really where the wealthy attend that kind of a level of school. There's a great documentary called 7 Up, and it follows 7 kids. Actually, now they've been doing it every 7 years, and those kids are now in their 50s. But it showed how kids are really pegged at a very early age for education, and to see who goes on to what they call university. So school is definitely required for all children until the age of 18, and you do find that a lot of kids, depending on what their family background is, will stop school at the age of 14. That is what we call a mandatory education law, so that's very important as well. College admission is very much linked to entrance exams. So if you, can't get by with either who you know or just a good GPA and how you've done all throughout school, you have to take an entrance exams. That is very different to what we have in the United States. We really, for the most part, have equal opportunity and practical learning. We'll talk about community colleges here in a moment, but if you want to go to school and you have obviously haven't dropped out in high school, or you've obtained that high school degree with relatively good grades, you can go to college. 4 out of 5 adults have completed high school. We'll talk about dropout rates, but actually, compared to other nations, we do pretty well. This is the literacy global perspective. Now look at this graph, and you can see that this is very much tied to the nation's wealth. Very, very much tied to the nation's wealth. And again, remember, we're talking about illiteracy illiteracy, so people who cannot read. And you can see that in the United States, Canada, over through Northern Europe, that clearly there is less than 5% of individuals who cannot read. But we definitely see a huge gap in Africa. Obviously predominantly sticks out, as well as Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. We have a very high rate of illiteracy. And once again, you think of how that ties to national wealth, for the most part, those countries who are fairly wealthy, their kids are educated with regards to reading. So the functions of schooling, and we will talk about this in human development, regardless of who's your instructor. You talk about this kind of formal entrance into school. School is very much a socialization kind of function. You not only get basic language and mathematics skills, but you also, in secondary school, definitely in middle school and high school, you have more of an expansion to talk about cultural values and norms. With cultural innovation, we can see that educational systems create and transmit culture. So, how kids dress, the different technology devices that they use in school, this definitely is surrounding culture as well. Social integration is really important. We have a very diverse nation in the United States, and because our schools are not segregated for the most part, you do have a kind of, hopefully, schools can combine and introduce kids to different cultures. And then social placement, there is an enhancement of meritocracy, which is you do your best, you try your hardest, you are going to be rewarded for that. If we look at educational achievement in the United States from 1910, obviously we're going to see that not many people were graduating from high school. That dramatically jumped, since now in 2008. We see several people who now obtain their high school graduate degrees, their high school degrees. If we look at college graduates, obviously very much the same. We have more opportunity for individuals to go to college, and more colleges as well. And then the number of years schooling, obviously now we see not just 12 years, but really since 1970, most people have some college, is what we would call that. So educational achievement in the United States has definitely grown. If we talk about, and your book identifies latent functions of schooling, some positive, some negative. There's been kind of with the induction of kindergarten, some of you may remember when kindergarten was half day. Very few schools still have half day kindergarten. For the most part, they're full day kindergarten. That really is tied to educational achievement. We found that kids who are 4 and 5 and 6 not only can tolerate a full day of school, but they're even talking about making preschool mandatory. Some have argued that schools serve as child care providers, and really, especially as kids enter into elementary school, that does provide a more kind of fruitful environment for them to learn, as opposed to being at like a child care center. So you could look at that as a negative thing. You could also argue that it's a positive thing as well, that it engages young people at a time in their lives when jobs are not plentiful. And obviously in our culture, we have actual laws that don't tolerate child labor laws or working at a very young age. So, definitely, you don't see a lot of 10, 11, 12-year-old kids working. Sets the stage for establishing relationships and networks. Definitely that social network that we've talked about, establishing different kinds of relationships, is important in schooling. And that link between particular schools and career opportunities. You see a vast widening of kids understanding what is out there with regards to job possibilities and opportunities. If we take a critical analysis, the functionalist approach overlooks that the quality of schooling is far greater for some than for others. And in the U.S. educational system, that really reproduces the class structure for each generation. There are some wonderful books out there that talk about how from a very early age, education is very much structured by social class. If you think of some of our elite schools, especially Ivy League schools, there is this structure of a legacy in that you don't really have to have the best GPA, the best grades to get in some of the elite schools. if you have the name and the status to get you there. It is very difficult for some of our kids that live in rural states such as Nebraska or rural communities to get into some of those Ivy League schools because they don't have the name, they don't have some of those recommendations, those highly sought after recommendations to get them to the next playing field. So many really feel that schooling really kind of encourages social disadvantage. We look at schooling and social interaction. There is, to an extent, your book mentions some of the different experiments essentially that have happened, and there is kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy that happens within school. If you think that you aren't going to do really well in school, nobody in your family's done really well in school, if you really have that thought, that kind of mindset, you're going to have a self-fulfilling prophecy. Hopefully many of you have read or have heard about the blue eye, brown eye experiment with the 4th grade students in 1968. There have been some different kind of versions of that, but really, for the most part, with regards to research ethics, it's hardly done. But it really did show that for kids who were stereotyped and were identified as the kids who, were marked as not having the good qualities, that those kids really suffered because of those stereotypes. Sometimes in class I have a lot of students who tie that into kind of this persona of the jock or the dropout, or some of those really predominant stereotypes that you see specifically in high school, and how that really can affect a person. And so, under this critical analysis where it says beliefs about inferiority and superiority are built into existing systems of inequality, many say that schools perpetuate that idea of inequality. So, again, take a look at that specific chapter, that specific section of the chapter, and it's really interesting. With regards to social control, this really relates to social inequality. Schools reinforce essentially the status quo. We have statistics on this, and having, really meeting the basic needs of people. These two theorists, sociologist Bowles and Gitness, looked back in the 19th century. The rise of public education really came when factory owners needed obedient, disciplined workers. And for any of you who have elementary school kids, or even know someone with elementary school kids, you know that there's a lot of obviously learning built into the curriculum, but a lot of it is very much following the rules. You have a lot of this pulling cards or pulling ribbons, and not stepping outside of the line of discipline. So many have really kind of argued that comes into this social control theory. There's a big discussion about standardized testing, ACTs, SATs, those reading and mathematic quizzes and exams that kids take for state boards, and they really discuss how many of the questions are very much biased by race, ethnicity, and class, specifically as well gender too, so that intersectionality kind of inequality. There were quiz questions or exam questions taken off of the ACT test over a decade ago that really identified how this was true. There was an analytical question that talked about horse riding and kind of breeding of horses, and this very kind of, it was set in kind of a stage of the sport of polo, and used some terms that really, if you were not familiar with the sport of polo, which typically, unless you are from a wealthier family or have kind of some roots in that, you would not know even what they were asking in the question. So that really went to kind of strengthen the argument that standardized testing is very much biased based on race, ethnicity, and culture. And then school tracking, there is this element of tracking, talking about assigning students to different types of educational programs. So we're going to talk about magnet schools and different schools that kind of gear students towards one way or another. And unfortunately, disadvantaged kids typically end up in the lower tracks. And that's not because, obviously, not because they're not smarter than the other kids, but they really haven't had the advantages. Many kids haven't had the opportunity for preschool and learning at an earlier age, or even coming from a calm environment to where it's conducive to learning after school and doing homework. So unfortunately, those disadvantaged kids end up in the lower tracks. again, with the school inequality, the difference between public education and private education. Obviously, if we were in a classroom setting, I would ask how many of you went to a public school and how many went to a private. We'd see fewer students who go to a private school, but if we talked about the differences in schooling, you would see that there are definite advantages to private schooling. You have fewer class sizes or a lower student-to-teacher ratio, and you have a lot of opportunity to be a part of certain clubs that more public schools are not accustomed to. And also keep in mind, not all public schools are the same. Although they technically get the same amount of funding for the most part under state guidelines, public schools rely significantly on parent involvement, more so than you realize. And for some schools that are more urban, or they have parents that are just not accessible because they're working 2 or 3 or 4 jobs, they don't have a lot of parent involvement and aren't able to have kind of that access. So public schools obviously are not all the same by any means. So for this last slide in this part of the lecture, just to talk about the critical analysis, the social conflict perspective minimizes the extent to which schooling enhances upward social mobility for talented men and women for all backgrounds. It actually says quite the opposite of that. Today's classes and the curriculum that you have, including sociology courses, really challenge social inequality. Some of your larger universities, obviously like UNL, you can take more advanced classes in sociology, one specifically for race and ethnicity, sociology of religion, and you can talk about the differences, again, like in religion or race and ethnicity, that many people experience. So we are trying to broaden people's kind of minds and horizons and mindsets about that. Unfortunately, most of the time you have to get to college to get there and to get that kind of knowledge. That's all I have for you in this first part of your lecture. We're going to have another part on education here shortly. Thank you.